Welcome back. We have two tasks ahead of us this time, a major overview of verbs, don't be frightened, and the first of two parts discussing words that are made of a single letter that attaches to the beginning of another word. First, verbs. We saw last time that vayomer, and he said, was based on 1, a root, aleph mem resh, 2, a particular kind of pattern that the root is plugged into that tells you when and how the verb was done, and 3, different prefix letters that change who's doing the verb. Vayomer, he said, vatomer, she said, vanomer, we said. The technical name for this form is the converted imperfect. The perfect and the imperfect are the two forms of the biblical Hebrew verb that tell you when and how the verb was done. And for these two forms, besides the root of the verb, you'll also need to know the PGN, person, gender, and number of the verb. Number means simply is it singular or plural. Gender, is it masculine, feminine, or common to both genders. And person, we don't think about this much in English, but we use it without thinking. I do, but he does. And perhaps you've read about someone that he talks about himself a lot in the third person. Here's what person means. First person, the person who's speaking, I in the singular and we in the plural. Second person, the person or people that we're speaking to, you. Third person, anyone else that we're speaking about, he, she, it, and they. So English has a third person singular neuter. Hebrew doesn't have it. English makes gender distinctions only in the third person singular. Hebrew makes them everywhere, but in the first person. And English, nowadays anyway, says you for everyone in the second person, while Hebrew has 4 different forms of you: masculine, feminine, singular, plural. Every verb in Hebrew can be described in this way. What is the root? What is the form? And, if it's perfect or imperfect, what is the PGN, person, gender, and number? So, vayomer is from aleph mem resh. It's converted imperfect. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. And it's third masculine singular, third person masculine singular, but I'm not going to keep saying person. In describing a verb, we just say first, second, and third. Now let's talk about tense, the part of a verb that tells you when it happened. I do, present tense. I did, past tense. 2 different forms for the different times. Contrast doing, which doesn't say anything about time. The standard way in Hebrew to say that someone did something in the past, the same form that's used for the past tense in the modern Hebrew that's spoken today, is a form that in biblical Hebrew is called the perfect. You can think of it as referring to actions in the past that have been perfected or completed. In Genesis 1 through 5, the story of the first day of creation, there are 3 of these forms. Bara, he created, in verse 1. Kara, he called, in verse 5. Both of those are third masculine singular. And hayata, it was, in verse 2. Third feminine singular, because eretz, earth, is a feminine noun. Third person means, in English terms, he, she, it, or they. Perfect verbs are marked for person, gender, and number by their endings. Hayta, instead of haya, marks this kind of verb as third feminine singular. But bara and kara in our passage don't have endings. They are unmarked. In the perfect, the unmarked form indicates third masculine singular. and the God of the Bible is grammatically masculine. Don't shoot the messenger. What about Eretz? Haaretz, the earth? We certainly wouldn't say that she was created. We would say it was created. However, there's no neuter in Hebrew. Eretz is a feminine noun, and it takes feminine forms whenever Hebrew calls for a gender distinction. Verbs, adjectives, and pronouns. In English, we would say it, but there is no it in Hebrew. That's the perfect form of the verb, the past tense. But long ago in the development of Hebrew, there was a different past tense form. We know a similar form from the cuneiform language called Akkadian. Nothing to do with our Cajuns in America. This is A-K-K-A-D, Akkadian, an ancient Semitic language. Not a sister language to Hebrew, but slightly more distantly related. Let's call it a second cousin. This other form still exists in Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, it's the future tense. In biblical Hebrew, it's used to indicate an action that's unfinished. That's the opposite of a perfect verb. It's the imperfect. But it also has a special use in biblical Hebrew. When you introduce it with a vav, a patach, and a dagesh in the prefix letter, that, quote unquote, converts the present or future meaning of the verb to a past tense. If you look at it historically, that form is reverting to its pre-Hebrew usage. What that means is that there are two different ways in biblical Hebrew to express the past tense, and we can see them both in Genesis 1:5a. Kara, he called. Vayikra, with a vav, a patach, and a dagesh in the prefix letter, also he called. Without the va, it's an imperfect form. With the va, the imperfect form is being converted to a perfect meaning. It's a converted imperfect. But there's a difference between a perfect verb and a converted imperfect verb, even though they both indicate the past tense. A converted imperfect verb tells you the sequence of events. Vayomer Elohim yehi or. God said, let there be light. Vayehi or, and then there was light. There are actually two different names for this verb form, describing the two different aspects of what it does. I call it the converted imperfect because, as you now understand, it takes an imperfect verb describing uncompleted action and converts it into a perfect meaning describing an action as finished. But it can also be called the imperfect consecutive because it's used to describe actions that occurred consecutively. It tells you what order things happened in. Now let's look again at Genesis 1:5. You remember that adding A or B to the verse number means the first half of the verse up to the etnachta or the second half of the verse. We've already learned 5b after the etnachta together. Vayehi erev, and there was evening. Vayehi voker, and then there was morning. Yom echad, one day. Now, 5a, with its two different ways of saying the past tense. First, let's learn this verb kara from the root kuf resh aleph. It means to call out loud, and therefore sometimes to read. But when you kara le something, literally call to it, that's our same English idiom as calling something in the sense of naming it. All right, here we go. Vayikra, and he called. Vayikra Elohim, and God called. Vayikra Elohim la'or, and God called the light something. What did he call it? Vayikra Elohim la'or yom. God called the light day. Remember Yom Echad, one day. Ve'lachoshech, and, that's ve, la-choshech, there's our l again, so this is what's going to be named. Choshech, the opposite of or, not light, but darkness. Ve'lachoshech kara laila. And the darkness he called night. Laila is night. Laila tov, good night. Not an expression that's actually used in the Bible, but it would have been perfectly comprehensible in biblical times. Now, Vayikra Elohim la'or yom, God called the light day. Why isn't it then Vayikra Elohim la'choshech laila, and God called the darkness night? Because that converted imperfect form, Vayikra, is also the imperfect consecutive. If we said Vayikra for both parts of this phrase, it would mean that God called the light day, and then afterward, he called the darkness night. But that's not what happened according to Genesis. The second phrase uses the regular past tense verb, the perfect kara. So God did not name light and darkness consecutively, but simultaneously. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom, ve lachoshech kara laila. And what happened after that? Vayihi erev, and then Vayihi voker, yom echad. Now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, if you'll get your pencils and scorecards ready, a very quick preview of all the different verb forms in Biblical Hebrew. There are 5 different verb forms. First, the 2 forms that tell you when and how someone did something, 2 tenses. And they are the forms we've already seen, the perfect and the imperfect. Since these 2 forms pin down the time when an action occurred, they are called finite verbs. Next, there's a form that's not finite, the infinitive. It's often used like our English infinitive, to call. The infinitive just describes the action, doesn't say anything about when the action happened or will happen, doesn't say anything about who did it or does it, just names that particular verb action. It's a verbal noun. So it's also used like our English gerund, calling someone by name. The biblical Hebrew infinitive is also the way to express a gerund because it's actually a noun form of the verb. Then there's a verbal adjective, using the verb to describe something. That's also the ing form in English, but it's used in a different way. Calling someone by name just describes the activity, doesn't say anything about when it happened or will happen, and it also doesn't say anything about who did it. But if I am calling, or you were calling, or she will be calling, then calling is an adjective that describes the person doing the action. Intuitively, it seems like a verb, but it's really a verbal adjective. I am calling, I am hungry. Both of them are adjectives describing me. The English grammatical term for a verbal adjective is a participle. That's the term we use for this form in Biblical Hebrew. Doesn't say when the action is taking place, but it does describe the person or thing doing the action. As we'll see when we learn adjectives, adjectives in Hebrew can be used as if they were nouns. Shofet is a participle from the verb that means to judge. I am judging Israel, ani shofet et Yisrael. But ani shofet can mean either I am judging or I am a judge. The Hebrew name for the book of Judges is Sefer Shoftim. And Shoftim, judges, is the masculine plural participle of that verb. It names the people who were judging, or more properly, ruling Israel during that period of history. If you want to be more literal, you could call it the book of judgers, but really rulers. That's the participle, our fourth verb form. And finally, there's the imperative, the command form. Be fruitful and multiply, pru urvu. Be fruitful and multiply, and that's an order. When you say something imperiously, that's the imperative, the form that issues a command. And those are the 5 forms of the verb. 2 finite verbs, verbs that point to the time something happened, the perfect and the imperfect. An infinitive, the verbal noun. A participle, the verbal adjective. And the imperative, the command form. That's it. All right, that is more than enough about verbs for now. Now we're going to start a topic that will carry over to next time about 5 Hebrew words, each spelled with a single letter that must always be attached to the front of another word. We've seen most of them already because it's extremely difficult to find a biblical verse that doesn't have any of them. So it's time for us to start learning them. And we're also going to go for broke and learn a 2-letter word, a separate word, which, like the individual letter words, is used to indicate something about the word that follows it. Here we go. Let's start by learning the rest of Genesis 1:1. We already learned the first 3 words, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created. And the rest of the verse tells us what he created. Et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Shamayim means sky or heaven. Eretz means earth or land. But what are ve, ha, and et? First, ve. Let's keep things simple to start out with and put this at the flashcard level. Ve means and. It's a conjunction. You use it to link 2 words or 2 phrases or 2 sentences together. Vav with a shva underneath it, v. Always attached to the beginning of some other word. What did God create? Et hashamayim, v, et haaretz, the sky and the earth. When you see a vav at the beginning of a word, the chances are 99 and 44/100% that what you're seeing is the conjunction v. The word vav itself occurs 13 times in the Bible. It means a hook. Look at it. And there are a handful of strange names that begin with vav, but Hebrew mostly avoids or changes words that begin with vav because vav at the beginning of a word is the conjunction. Now let's take this a couple of steps beyond simple. First with spelling and then with meaning. First, spelling. If you're creating flashcards, think of the word for and as v, a vav with a shva. But it's not always spelled that precise way because a letter that's attached to the beginning of a word can be very sensitive to its environment. I'm sure some of you, and maybe all of you, have already been thinking, hey, what about vayomer? Vayomer Elohim, and God said, has that conjunction. Why can't and he said just be vayomer? The answer is that the vav of vayomer is doing 2 different jobs. One of them is to say and, but the more important job it's doing is to convert that imperfect verb into a past tense, as we discussed. And that particular grammatical task demands va, not just v, but vav with a patach followed by a dagesh. There are also some phonological reasons why the spelling of v will change. By phonological reasons, I mean reasons related to the sounds that your mouth is making or trying to make. The biggest one is the rule of Shva. What is the rule of Shva? It's the rule that you can't have two Shvas in a row at the beginning of a word. What happens when you do? Something's got to give. Normally what gives is that the first Shva changes to a chirek, an E sound. This happens with Vav too, but only under unusual circumstances, most often if the next letter is Yud. Because remember, Vav is related to our letter W, and it's used to mark the vowels O and U. So to avoid two Shvas at the beginning of a word, Vav prefers to change itself into an U vowel. Here's an example. The name Samuel in Hebrew is Shmuel, not S-A, Samuel, but Shin Shva, Shmuel, Shva under the first letter. What happens when I need to attach V to it? Look at Jeremiah 15:1, which talks about Moses and Samuel, Moshe u Shmuel. Not Moshe v Shmuel, can't say that in biblical Hebrew, but Moshe u Shmuel. The conjunction v changes when you add it to a word that already begins with consonant Shva, it changes to u. Another of the possible changes is this. When you put vav in front of a word that's accented on the first syllable, of course if the word only has one syllable, then v often becomes va, spelled with a kamatz. So when Genesis 8:22 talks about day and night, you remember Yom Echad, one day, and night is Laila, so day and night is Yom Va Laila. Here's another example, wood and stone, Eitz Va Even. It's va, not v, when it's followed immediately by a word that's accented on the first syllable. Another word you know that's accented on the first syllable is melech, but there's another rule that takes precedence in this case, which I'm teaching you now only because it's such a fun rule. It's the bump rule. When vav precedes a bet, a mem, or a pei, BMP, it always changes into an u. So it's Melech Yisrael, the king of Israel, and the king of Judah, U Melech Yehuda, not the Melech Yehuda. Happens with bet and pei as well as with mem, so it's the bump rule. There's some other possible changes too, but we'll look at them another time. You're not writing biblical Hebrew, so you don't need to be able to produce these changes yourself. You just need to be able to recognize them. I'm telling you these rules so you don't think the changes are just random. So much for the spelling of v. Now a little bit more about the meaning. V does not always have to mean and. It can also mean or. His son, Bino, or his daughter, U Vito. Remember the bump rule that v changes to u before bet, mem, and pei. That u is our conjunction v. And in this case, it means or. Bino U Vito, his son or his daughter. And that vav can also mean but. Famous phrase from the Song of Songs, I am black but beautiful. Shchora ani v'nava. Nothing to do with Africa. She means she's been blackened by the sun like a farm woman. Doesn't have that beautiful white skin of the girls who live in a palace and never lift a finger. So v is used to link things, mostly with and, but sometimes with but or even or. Now let's move on to our next attached letter. Ha shamayim and ha aretz. The sky and the earth. Ha is a the. Like almost everything we'll learn, it's not quite that simple, but let's start out the simple way. Ha is the. ha-shamayim, the sky, ha-aretz, the earth. Now let's look at it a little bit more closely. The sound ha can mean lots of different things in Hebrew, but when it means the, it's spelled in a specific way. Hey with a patach, ha, and a dagesh in the next letter. Look at the shin of hashamayim and you'll see it. That dot in the shin, that dagesh, is part of the Hebrew word that means the. But just as there are 6 letters, the Beged Kefet letters, that take a dagesh for phonological reasons as well as grammatical reasons, so too, as we've mentioned, there are 5 letters that just won't take a dagesh even for a grammatical reason. That means the spelling of the word ha has to change. If you put it on a word that begins with one of those 5 letters, what are you going to do? Do you remember which letters those are? They are the 4 guttural letters, Aleph, Hey, Chet, and Ayin, and 1 letter, Resh, that's a guttural wannabe. So when you want to take Eretz, earth, and change it to Ha-Aretz, the earth, besides that switch from Eretz to Aretz, which is peculiar to this word, Eretz begins with an Aleph, and you can't put a dagesh in an Aleph, so what do? Well, what a dagesh is theoretically doing is doubling the consonant that it's in. Not writing it twice, but making the consonant longer. If you can't lengthen that consonant, one of the things that can happen is that you compensate by lengthening the previous vowel. And you remember that there are long vowels and short vowels. Patach is a short A vowel. The long A vowel is kamatz. So hashamayim, the sky, is spelled with Hey, patach, and a dagesh. Haaretz, the earth, is spelled with Hey, kamatz, and no dagesh, because you can't put a dagesh in an Aleph. And a couple more examples. Ha-malka, the queen, with a patach and a dagesh in the mem, but ha-isha, the woman, with a kamatz and no dagesh. There are a few other ways the definite article can be spelled. You can find them in the course guidebook. I want to mention just one more because it's not uncommon and because it has a different vowel sound. First, let's learn a new word. Har, a mountain. Mount Zion, Har Zion. Mount Sinai, Har Sinai. Har Hermon, Mount Hermon, up in the Panhandle where Israel meets Lebanon and Syria. And it's one har, many harim, mountains. But the mountains are he-harim. From Deuteronomy 12:2, al-he-harim, on the mountains, ve'al-hagvaot, and on the hills. Just like heaven and earth go together in rhetoric and poetry, shamayim va'aretz, so do mountains and hills, harim and givaot. But it's he-harim, ha plus dagesh, givaot. The rule is in the guidebook, but let your ear get used to the sound. Now a quick bit of English grammar. The word the, T-H-E, is called the definite article. It's used to pick out something specific from a more general category, a man versus the man. English also has an indefinite article, a man, not a specific one. And if the word begins with a vowel, then instead of a, we say an, a pear or an apple. Hebrew does not have an indefinite article. Every once in a while, they use the word one as if it were an indefinite article. So when we're translating Genesis 1 through 5, there was evening and there was morning, one day, we might have said, Vayihi Erev, there was evening, Vayihi Voker, and there was morning, Yom Echad, a day. That's possible, but there are not many cases where one must be understood as a or an. In the vast majority of cases where English would use the indefinite article, Hebrew simply omits it. So if English requires it, we just have to insert it. In Genesis 1 through 5, English doesn't demand it, but the Hebrew does permit it. So we might translate Vayihi Erev, there was an evening, Vayihi Voker, and there was a morning, Yom Echad, one day. There are other ways a noun can be definite. I can tell them to you in Hebrew, but we actually have exactly the same thing in English. So a king is indefinite, and the king, ha-melech, is definite, but so is his king, malko. Anything that's specified with a possessive pronoun is definite. Everyone has a nose, but this is my nose, a definite nose. And the third way to identify something as definite is to use its name. You can't get much more definite than calling someone by name. A king could be any king, but David is a definite king, David. Once more, there are three ways of identifying something as definite rather than indefinite. One, by using the definite article, the in English, ha in Hebrew. Two, by labeling it with a personal pronoun, his king, malko. And three, by naming it, Hamelech David, King David. Which leads us to et, the marker of the definite direct object of a verb. God did not create a heaven and an earth, shamayim va'aretz, but the heaven and the earth, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. This is a grammatical function that we don't really need in English because our English word order is so specific. When I say Bob kicked the ball, you know that Bob is the subject of the sentence, he's doing the kicking, and the ball is the object of the verb, it's being kicked. But what tells you that is the order of the words. Hebrew word order is more flexible, and so they developed this special indicator. Genesis 1:27, God created the human. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. This is not yet Adam with a capital A, it is ha'adam, the human or the earthling. The makes this human definite, so it's Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. And notice that et is connected to the next word with a makef, so it has no accent. What therefore happened? The vowel became a little shorter and changed to a segol. Still the same word, but a slightly shorter vowel. Vayivra et ha'adam. But Genesis 4:32 says that God created a human upon the earth. Bara Elohim Adam al haaretz. If you create a human, that's indefinite. So bara Elohim Adam. But if you create the human, that's a definite direct object. So it's Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. And when the direct object of the verb is a pronoun, you can stick those same endings on the direct object indicator et. When you put a suffix on it, it becomes ot. So Genesis 1:27, God created the human, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. But that verse continues by telling us, in the image of God, he created him, bara oto. Male and female, he created them, bara otam. Et him, that's oto, et them, that's otam, the definite direct object marker, but instead of marking a noun, it's got a pronoun suffix attached. Et changes to ot, so you can stick on those endings. And that is our lesson for today. Your challenge in Numbers 22 is to find 5 examples of the conjunction v, 5 of the definite article ha, and 5 of the definite direct object marker et. With a segol or a tsere, it's the same word. Next time, 3 more one-letter words.